Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this episode of the Better World Humans podcast. In this episode, I interview Professor at the University of Oregon in the Inside Out program, Kevin Alltucker. In this conversation, we talk about why it's so important for those who are incarcerated to have access to education, why behavioral therapy is crucial for children to outgrow some of the trauma that they go through, and why we should be smart on crime instead of tough on crime. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to the Better World Humans podcast, Kevin. It's great to have you on today. How are you?
Good to see you, Justin. I'm doing well.
All right, awesome. So I know you have a great story of becoming a professor and working in the Inside Out program, and I'm just curious, what's the journey been like to become a professor?
I do. I have a unique pathway into academia, I think. So I was originally a construction engineer. So I'm a proud graduate of Oregon State University, and I was an engineer for about 20 years and worked in the heavy construction field. And when my wife and I moved back to Eugene in the early 90s, we became involved with a nonprofit organization called the Relief Nursery. And the Relief Nursery is a child abuse prevention agency, and they provide kind of support services, wraparound services for families with young children. And those volunteer experiences really shaped a change in my career. And so the more that I volunteered for the nursery and the more I became involved, the more I was both fascinated at the issues around child abuse and neglect, but then I was horrified at the level of abuse and neglect in our own community. And then finally, I was a little bit ashamed and sheepish that I wasn't aware of the magnitude of the problem. You know, I grew up here in Eugene, spent most of my life here in Eugene, and for me, you know, as a privileged white man, I was kind of insulated from a lot of the struggles that many people in our community face. And so I was not feeling great about that. Fast forward, it just became really apparent to me that I needed to study the effects of child abuse and neglect on kind of human development. And I went back to the University of Oregon in the year 2000, and I got a PhD in education, and I was able to study and research the effects of early childhood trauma and how that affects a person's development as a teenager, and how that affects their involvement in the juvenile justice system, and then how that affects them as they continue those behaviors and get involved with the adult criminal justice system. And so I was really fortunate to be able to have a teaching job at the University of Oregon from 2004 until 2017, when my position kind of changed a little bit. So that's my entry into academia. It's unusual, but I think it's given me different perspectives as I finish my career in academia.
Yeah, I think that's a cool story because you had this career shift that really catalyzed by a volunteer experience and just recognizing the child abuse and neglect that's going on in your own backyard where you grew up is probably an eye-opening experience. And then going into, determining, oh, this actually has an effect on, youth going into the juvenile justice system, which then has them cycling in and out and ending up in the adult justice system. And
Yeah.
for those listening, I took a class with Kevin, Tough on Crime or Smart on Crime, on juvenile justice, and we will get into that topic. So before that, let's, scale it back a little bit and let's talk about the Inside Out program, which is actually the class that I was able to take with you. For those that are listening, what is the Inside Out program and what's its mission and how is the mission achieved?
Yeah, the Inside Out program is it's a program that takes university students inside a prison, and there is a class that is held for the academic term. And so half the class are folks who are incarcerated in that prison, and half the class are university students. And so you can imagine this is a remarkable thing that happens. And it plays into the mission of the Inside Out program, which is if we bring these two groups together and learn about the topic really doesn't matter, but if we're in this shared space together and we're listening to each other's experiences and understanding each other as human beings, then good things happen in our society. So the incarcerated folks, their life is improved because of this educational opportunity. Many of the incarcerated people earn college credit, and many of my, we call them inside students, those are the incarcerated people. Many of my inside students have earned their undergraduate degrees while inside, and it's remarkable. And of course, the experiences that the outside students, the university students, the experiences that they have during this really unique opportunity is often, I say life-changing. I don't know if that's overstating it, but I certainly hear that from outside students. Like, that Inside Out class was mind-blowing, right? I just had no idea that these things were happening, or I have a better understanding about folks who are incarcerated, and I have a better understanding about the criminal justice system, and so on and so forth. But just one more kind of description. I wanted to start with like the impact of the Inside Out program, and now I want to tell you about what it is and how it started, and like, well, why does the University of Oregon have an Inside Out program? So Inside Out started about 20 years ago at Temple University in Philadelphia, and Lori Pompa was she started the Inside Out program. She thought, hey, I'm going to take university students inside a prison, and we're going to have a class together, and that's how it started. Since then, there have been 50,000 graduates of Inside Out courses, and that includes both inside students and outside students. There's over 1,000 certified Inside Out instructors, mostly in the United States, but certainly in other countries abroad. I'm one of those. I'm a certified Inside Out instructor, and I'm one of about 9 or 10, maybe a dozen certified instructors at the University of Oregon. And the University of Oregon has one of the largest Inside Out programs in the nation. I won't say it's the largest, but it's up there. So that's kind of the history and the impact of the Inside Out program.
Yeah, I can testify that it is a life-changing experience, understanding different perspectives. That I know that you talk about how the prison population is probably the most isolated population in the United States. And in the United States, we incarcerate more people than any other country. And off the top of my head, I don't know the number, but I think there are a lot of common misconceptions about the criminal justice system. And it's kind of an interesting thing where I call it the Department of Corrections. And we have these kind of ironic conversations of, are they really correcting behavior? And my question is, like, what is the importance of bringing in students from the outside to see what's going on with life in the inside?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that the greatest benefit is, as you say, the incarcerated population in the United States is the most segregated population that we have. And certainly there are other segregated communities in our nation, but folks who are behind bars and in prison, I would argue they're the most segregated. And there's not a lot of daylight, that's kind of shown on what happens behind the prison walls. And so one of the biggest benefits is to have outside students come in and see what happens, see and experience kind of the daily things that incarcerated people have to deal with, on a daily basis. So I think that's the biggest thing. And while I'm listening to myself talk, is like, the Inside Out program is not a whistleblower program. That's really important for your folks to understand. But it is a way to get outside eyes in on a community that doesn't have a lot of outside eyes. And so I think that's healthy.
it's healthy in a way of, yeah, we are able to talk about their experiences outside because they don't have social media and they don't have these platforms, putting out their messages. So I do think that is a very valuable part. And I know you just finished a research paper on critical race theory here in Lane County, and it's kind of an interesting
Mhm.
thing because we're both white and white males, and especially in Lane County, there's most of the population is white.
Yep.
So it's fascinating that you do some research and you go in, and even in such a a highly concentrated white community, there's still blatant racism going on in the criminal justice system. Could you talk more about that?
Sure. Yeah. And it's funny. Some folks they don't use the term criminal justice. They use the term adult legal system to kind of a tip of the hat or a wink of an eye. Like, I don't know if justice is being served. Certainly legal processes are happening, but I use criminal justice term, so you'll hear me say that as well. Critical race theory is a kind of a collection of things, of theories that have come together since the early 70s. And basically, the major components are that the racial categories that we have, they're basically made up, right? There's no significant biological differences between races. You've all heard like, well, we're like 99.9% the same in terms of DNA. Yeah, that's right. The racial categories were developed by white folks, and critical race theory purports that they were made up to keep the pecking order, to keep whites in power, to keep whites having access to resources, um, and power. And so that's one of the components. Like, the racial categories are made up, and we just, our society just kind of accepts them, like, oh well, there are these different races. But what we're talking about are differences in how people look. It's how they appear, right? That's how we kind of categorize folks. And then to think that we would assign behavioral characteristics to how somebody looks is just, it's crazy to me. And so that's one thing I really gravitate towards, that component of critical race theory. The other component there's two others that I'm going to talk about. And one of them is this importance of stories, the counter stories, the stories from usually minority groups or disenfranchised populations or marginalized people. Those stories need to be heard. They need to be put forward. We need to make a place to have those stories be heard, because they're part of the truth. They're part of our entire story. And if we just rely on the dominant culture story to tell the so-called truth, then we're leaving out a significant portion of the truth. So the importance of counter stories, super, super important. Yeah, that's probably, there's 6 components, and I'm trying to think if it would be worthwhile for your folks to hear about. So racial categories are made up, the importance of counter stories, and then that racism is ordinary, right? Folks of color experience racism as part of their everyday lives. And so those are probably the 3 things that I would want to tell your viewers.
Absolutely. And how does that show up in the Lane County adult legal system?
Yeah, so I'll talk about the, I'm going to hold up the copy of my report right here. It has to do with the Lane County juvenile system. And so how that shows up is it gets back to our previous conversation about child abuse and neglect. So if there is a common thread that runs through the juvenile justice system and the adult legal system, now I'm not going to say criminal justice system, but if there's a common thread, that common thread is trauma, and more specifically, early childhood trauma. And so the report that I did for Lane County Juvenile Justice made the statement that what happens to a young person before they enter the doors of the juvenile justice system has more to do with how they kind of navigate through the system and whether they continue into the adult system. And so, to put a really fine point on that, generally, youth of color have higher levels of trauma compared to their white counterparts for a variety of reasons. Also, structural racism is part of that, right? So they're experiencing trauma from the effects of structural racism, less access to educational opportunities, less access to healthcare, less access to housing, less, all these things that we know that folks of color have less access to. And so that contributes to their higher level of trauma in general. Of course, we can find exceptions, but in general. And so these youth of color are being propelled kind of faster and hotter into the juvenile justice system. And unfortunately, some of those youth of color, they continue their offending and their criminal acts, and they end up in the adult system. So that's kind of the synopsis of the report. I will give a shout out to Lane County Juvenile Justice in that 10 years ago, they realized that the disproportionality of youth of color in the system was a problem, and they started addressing it 10 years ago. So they're probably a little bit farther along than most jurisdictions. But what was unique about my report was like, hey, yeah, it matters of how you treat a youth of color once they get in the system, but let's not forget what happened before they got here. And often that conversation just hasn't taken place, right? Most researchers haven't even looked at that. So that was the unique feature of my report.
So it's kind of like it's meeting these youth of color where they're at instead of just putting them, cycling them through this criminal justice system and not giving them the justice that they, know and deserve. So, taking kind of a few steps back, what are, the potential options, policy options to support these youth of color and make sure that they don't go down this track to be in the legal system for their entirety of their lives?
Yeah. So a couple things come to mind. One of them is focusing on trauma. So our society needs to do a better job of preventing that trauma from happening. And so if you go back to the top of our conversation where, I was fascinated with the effects of early childhood abuse and neglect, we have to do a better job of supporting families in our community, right? That have young children, because those are really they're super critical years of development and formation, right? And if our families and our communities aren't able to function at a high enough level where they are helping to develop healthy young people who will, grow into healthy adults, then that's the root of the problem. That's where we need to focus our resources. And what that looks like, it looks like a lot of different things. And the Boys and Girls Club is an example of that, right? That's providing positive adult mentors. That's providing, healthy physical activities, a safe place, a place to increase social skills. That's fantastic. And we need to concentrate on even younger kids. So concentrate on preventing the trauma. And if trauma is occurring, then we need to do a better job of treating that trauma. So our interventions within the juvenile justice system need to be trauma informed, right? We need to take the trauma that these young people have experienced into account in designing our interventions to recognize that.
So does these certain policies, do they come at a state level? We have a new federal administration coming in January. Is that going to change things? How does that work? Or is that more on a local level?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of federal, state, and local. And I'll start federally. Yes, the new administration, I don't know what their stance is going to be on, trauma-informed treatment for youth involved in the juvenile justice system, or heck, even trauma-informed treatment for adults, in the adult prison system. I don't know what their stance is going to be. I hope that it is. I hope that it is trauma-based. It's interesting. Joe Biden has this kind of history of voting for tough on crime legislation. He was one of the architects of some really strict legislation that kind of set the table for these tough on crime policies. So it'll be interesting if he, shifts from that. I think he will. I hope he does, but we'll see. Statewide, the state has what's called the Oregon Youth Authority, and they're that's the state juvenile justice system. And they are already moving towards trauma-informed treatment. So this is not a new thing, a new process. They've started, I'll say 5 years ago. And then certainly locally, Lane County has made steps towards trauma-informed treatment. They understand the importance of that, and they are making steps accordingly. But there's a lot of work to do in that regard.
Yeah, there's still definitely a lot of work to do, and it sounds like almost it's one big puzzle, and every different little administration, whether it be local, state, federal, is has their certain pieces of that puzzle. And as we wrap up this conversation, my last question is how can we empower or bring to light some of these stories and narratives of people of color, and honestly just trauma informed treatment in the future?
I think there's one kind of basic thing, and this happened to me. So when I first started kind of being interested in the prison system, the first thing that struck me was the racial disproportionalities of folks who are incarcerated. So most of the people in our prison system, and when I say most, it's in high 50%, maybe low 60%, are people of color. And when I first saw that, it was like, well, why is that? People of color commit crimes at the same level that white folks commit crimes. So, I mean, that's not an explanation. So the explanation that I came to was, well, we've got structural racism at play here. That was like the evidence that hit me in the face. And so I think one thing that people can do that's easy is to become educated on the racial disproportionalities and the history of structural racism that's baked into our legal systems. And a good way to do that is to watch the documentary 13th, which is about the 13th Amendment, which actually allows slavery in the United States as long as it's part of the punishment of a crime. And a lot of people don't understand that. So the documentary is an hour and something long. It's available, I see, on YouTube now. That is a great place to start. And I think people, if you haven't seen that, if you're not aware of the issues around structural racism in our legal systems, you need to watch it. Because that's not it. What we have now isn't the America that I grew up thinking. It's not the America that I want. And until people become educated on and aware of these issues, we're not going to be able to make changes.
That's a great message to leave us off on. And yeah, I agree. I've seen 13th twice, and each time I watch it, I see something new, and it's eye opening, especially as a white male who, I actually went through and read through some of my reflections preparing for this interview from our class. And there are a lot of things that I did as a high schooler that was probably breaking the law. And because I had, loving, supporting parents and I'm white, I got away with it. So
Yeah.
I remember in class being like, holy crap, like I get away with a lot. I'm in this position because of the color of my skin, my socioeconomic background, and obviously I have a wonderful family. And so I'm really grateful in that regard, but it's also my responsibility to have the Better World Humans podcast and interview, people like you that are making a difference and bringing light to all these issues. So thank you so much for your time today, Kevin.
It's great to see you, Justin, and good luck. Yeah, this is great. I've enjoyed it.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode of the Better World Humans podcast. Hope you all are feeling inspired. And if you are, make sure to subscribe and tell your friends about it too. We're trying to grow a Better World Human movement. Until next time, cheers.